Welcome back to our channel World of Royals.
The era of royal silence is over. For nearly a century, the British monarchy followed one unbreakable rule: never complain, never explain. It was more than tradition. It was their shield, the system that kept them stable while everything else changed. But in 2026, that rule didn't just weaken. It collapsed. Completely. The silence is gone. And behind the walls of Windsor, something far more calculated has taken its place. This is no longer a family issue. This is something bigger. A controlled, institutional response. And at the center of it all is Prince William, operating with a level of precision that even insiders didn't expect. Because what we are seeing now is not emotion. It is strategy. It is structure. And it is only just beginning. If you thought the tension between the palace and the Sussexes had already reached its peak, you were wrong. That was just the surface. Because everything changed with one moment. A leak. Not a rumor. Not speculation. A real leak that moved through the royal inner circle like a shockwave. Private notes. Internal messages. Strategic documents from 2021 to 2023. All suddenly exposed. But these were not emotional conversations. They were structured, deliberate, and according to insiders, they revealed something the palace could not ignore. A pattern, a system, a strategy. At the center of it, one line. A sentence that reportedly changed how Prince William saw everything. The Duchess had allegedly written that if the institution would not protect her, then the narrative would. And that idea triggered alarm. Because inside the monarchy, reputation is everything. It is the currency that holds the entire system together. And if that currency is being reshaped, redirected, or used to build something outside the institution, then it stops being personal. It becomes a threat. From the palace's perspective, this was no longer frustration. It looked like coordination. A long-term media strategy designed to shift public perception. And once something reaches that level, the rules change. Because threats to individuals can be ignored, but threats to the institution are handled differently, quietly, precisely, systematically. And this was only the beginning. Because while the public focused on headlines, something far more serious was happening behind closed doors. Inside the king's private office, a decision was being made. A decision that would change everything. King Charles realized that the old approach, silence and patience, was no longer working. So he made a move. Not a suggestion. An order. Responsibility for the entire situation was handed directly to William and Catherine. No more committees. No more confusion. From that moment forward, there would be one authority. One strategy. And Prince William was at the center of it. Fully in control. This was a major shift. Because normally the monarch handles issues like this. But this time it was different. It required speed, clarity, and decisive action. And by placing William in charge, the message was clear. The future of the monarchy would not operate like the past. And under this new system, communication became controlled. Carefully, deliberately. Only one voice would speak. No leaks. No mixed narratives. Just one unified position. And behind that position was Catherine, working quietly, but strategically, because she understood something critical. The monarchy survives on perception, on stability, on consistency, and anything that threatens that image cannot be allowed to spread. So the approach changed completely. This was no longer about waiting. It was about preparation. Systems were built. Protocols were defined. Designed to respond instantly. Not reactively, but proactively. And before any of this became public, there was one final attempt. A private call between the two brothers. Not for emotion, but for correction. William wanted clarity. He wanted the record addressed. But the response he received changed everything. Because in that moment, it became clear. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a choice. And from that point forward, everything shifted. Everything shifted after that moment. Because what happened next was something the modern monarchy had avoided for decades. Prince William stepped forward himself. No anonymous sources, and quiet briefings, and indirect messaging. This time it was direct. At Kensington Palace, in a setting built on tradition and authority, William did something unexpected. He spoke.
Calm.
Controlled.
Precise.
But beneath that calm, there was something else. Finality. He didn't use vague language. He didn't soften his words. Instead, he addressed the situation head-on. He made it clear that no member of the royal family had mistreated the Duchess. He rejected the idea of favoritism. And he directly challenged the narrative that had been building for years. This wasn't defensive. It was corrective. For the first time, the palace wasn't staying silent. It was pushing back. And then he went further. He introduced something new. Something the public had never seen before from the monarchy. Evidence. William spoke about patterns, not isolated incidents, but repeated actions. He referenced targeted media stories, strategic placements, and what he described as deliberate attempts to damage reputations. Especially during sensitive moments. The message was clear. This was not random. This was not accidental. This was structured. And by framing it this way, William changed everything. Because if the narrative was being built intentionally, then it was no longer personal. It was a system. And systems can be challenged. Legally. Structurally.
Directly.
At that point, the situation evolved again. This was no longer about family. It was no longer just about public opinion. It had become something bigger. A confrontation between an institution and what it now viewed as an external operation. And with that shift came a new strategy. One that moved beyond words. Behind the scenes, the palace had already started analyzing how certain stories were spreading. They were tracking timing,
Patterns.
amplification. They were connecting media outlets to reactions. And what they found confirmed their concerns. This wasn't random attention. It followed structure. And anything with structure
Can be countered.
that was the signal William sent. Without raising his voice, without breaking royal protocol, he made one thing very clear. The palace was no longer going to sit still. But what surprised people the most wasn't just what he said. It was who he mentioned. In a move that caught many off guard, William brought up Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, a figure with her own complicated history inside the royal family. He suggested there had been attempts to draw her into the situation, to position her as part of a wider alignment. But by bringing this into the open, he shut that door
Completely.
and in doing so, he sent a message, not just to one person, but to everyone connected to the institution. There would be no divisions, no internal alliances, no side positions. You were either aligned with the institution or outside of it. And then came the most powerful comparison. William spoke about accountability, not as an idea, but as a rule, one that applies to everyone. And to reinforce that point, he referenced Prince Andrew, a name that carries serious weight, a reminder of what happens when the institution draws a line. By placing the current situation in that same context, William wasn't just speaking. He was defining consequences. Real ones. Loss of role. Loss of position. Loss of connection. The message was clear. No one is above the institution. Not by title. Not by history. Not by proximity. And from that moment, the strategy became even clearer. Silence, but not the old kind. This was not passive silence. This was controlled non-engagement. A decision to stop feeding the cycle. No responses. No reactions. No participation in ongoing narratives. If stories continued, they would stand alone, without support, without opposition, because the palace understood something simple. Attention fuels momentum, and without attention, momentum fades.
Slowly.
Quietly, but effectively. And this was not a short-term move. This was a long-term strategy. But even then, that wasn't the full picture, because there was another layer, a quieter one, more sensitive, more important, and it involved the next generation, the children. And what William said about them added a completely new dimension to the entire situation. But even as the situation escalated, there was another layer, quieter, more sensitive, and far more important. It involved the children. In a rare and carefully controlled moment, William addressed it. Not aggressively, not emotionally, but with clarity. He spoke about stability, about privacy, about the importance of growing up away from constant public conflict. He didn't make accusations. He didn't suggest action. But the message was still there.
Clear.
The institution was watching, not to interfere, but to ensure boundaries were not crossed. Because in this new approach, even the most personal aspects of the situation were being viewed differently. Not emotionally, but protectively. And as these statements reached the public, reactions started forming quickly. In the UK, support was strong. Many saw this as leadership, a clear stance, a necessary shift, someone finally stepping forward to protect the institution. But in the US, the reaction was different, more divided, more critical. Some viewed it as control. Others saw it as resistance. Two different perspectives, two different interpretations. And the palace was fully aware of both. Because this was no longer a local issue. It was global. And instead of trying to win everywhere, they focused on something else. Consistency, control, stability. Because this was never about popularity. It was about continuity. And while the public debated, something far more serious was already in motion behind the scenes. Something prepared quietly, developed carefully, and, if executed, it would change everything. It had a name. Order W-17. Inside royal circles, this wasn't just another document. It was something much bigger. A mechanism, a legal pathway, a structured plan designed to do something that had not been done in generations. To completely sever ties. Not temporarily, not symbolically, but permanently. And that made it serious. Because this wouldn't just affect individuals. It would reshape the institution itself. If activated, Order W-17 would move into formal legal territory. A request to the Privy Council, the body that deals with constitutional decisions. This is where things move beyond headlines and into law. Because removing titles, removing roles, removing recognition is not simple. It requires process, justification, legal strength, and most importantly, it must survive scrutiny. Because if it fails, the consequences wouldn't just be public. They would be constitutional. And that is why behind the scenes, legal teams were already working. Carefully, step by step, studying past laws, reviewing historical cases, looking for the strongest possible framework. One of the key references under consideration was the Titles Deprivation Act of 1917, a law once used in extreme situations. But applying it now, in a modern, global environment, would be complex, highly sensitive, and heavily examined. Because today, every move is analyzed, every decision questioned, every step debated. So the goal was not speed. It was precision. The palace wasn't looking for drama. They were looking for something else. A clean separation. Quiet. Controlled. Legally secure. And, if successful, the effects would be absolute. Titles removed. Roles erased. Recognition withdrawn. Access cut off. And most importantly, the connection itself would disappear. Not loudly. Not publicly attacked. But quietly removed. As if it never existed in the system. This wasn't punishment. It was redefinition. A shift from inside to outside. And once that line is crossed, there is no return. But even this was not the full strategy. Because while legal frameworks were being built, another plan was already unfolding. One that didn't rely on laws, or statements, or announcements. A quieter plan, more subtle, but far more powerful. And it had already begun. The most powerful part of this strategy was not what people could see. It was what they couldn't. Because while the public focused on speeches, legal moves, and headlines, the palace had already begun something far more subtle. A process of quiet removal. Not loud, not confrontational, but systematic. This wasn't about fighting a narrative. It was about disconnecting it. Slowly, piece by piece. Behind the scenes, digital structures were being adjusted. Official websites were reorganized. Hierarchies were being shifted. Positions were being quietly redefined, and unless someone was paying very close attention, they wouldn't even notice. Profiles were moved lower, visibility reduced, references became less prominent. Search results began to change. It was gradual, controlled, intentional, because in today's world, visibility is power. And when you reduce visibility, you reduce influence. Not instantly, but over time. And that was the goal. Not confrontation, but detachment. A strategy some insiders describe as administrative distancing, where the connection still exists on paper, but in reality, it no longer functions the same way. This wasn't a public removal. It was structural, a quiet repositioning that slowly changes perception. And this approach had a major advantage. It avoided escalation. No headlines to react to. No statements to challenge. No conflict to amplify. Just absence. And over time, absence changes everything. Because when something is no longer visible, no longer mentioned, no longer part of the main structure, it begins to feel separate, detached, and eventually irrelevant. But this phase didn't happen alone. It was accelerated by something unexpected, a moment that shifted global attention overnight. The situation involving Prince Andrew, a development that brought intense scrutiny back onto the monarchy. Legal pressure, public attention, international focus. For many institutions, a moment like that creates instability. But here, it became something else, an opportunity, because the palace made a clear decision. They did not intervene. They did not protect. They allowed the process to unfold fully. And in doing so, they sent a message stronger than any statement. There are limits to protection, clear limits. And those limits apply to everyone. No exceptions. Not by status.
Not by history.
Not by title. This wasn't just about one person. It was a signal, a demonstration of a new model. One where the institution does not override external systems, but works alongside them, even when the outcome is uncomfortable. And that message did not go unnoticed, especially internationally, because if the institution was willing to step back in one case, then the implications were clear for others. Protection was no longer guaranteed, and alignment with the institution was no longer optional. It was required. Otherwise, the system would continue without you. And as that realization spread, the effects began to show. Projects that depended on royal association faced challenges. Narratives that once held weight began to weaken. Because, without reinforcement from the institution, the connection fades.
Slowly,
but consistently. And this revealed something important. This strategy was never about quick results. It was about long-term change. A gradual shift in perception. A slow redefinition of relevance. And while all of this was happening, another layer was forming. Quietly, the monarchy began strengthening its core presence. Through public work. Through visibility in service. Through consistent engagement. Building stability on one side, while reducing connection on the other. A controlled balance. And at the center of it all, William and Catherine. Maintaining presence where needed. Maintaining silence where necessary. Every move intentional. Every absence deliberate. And slowly, the bigger picture began to change. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But steadily. The narrative that once dominated attention began to fade. And something else started taking its place. A new direction. A new focus. A new identity. But even then, there was still one final phase left. The part that would decide everything. Because reducing visibility is one thing, but replacing it completely is something else. And that final phase was already beginning. The final phase of this strategy was never about confrontation. It was about replacement. Because the palace understood something critical. You don't win a long-term narrative battle by arguing with it. You win by making it irrelevant. By building something stronger, more stable, more consistent. Something that naturally takes its place. And that is exactly what began to happen. As 2026 moved forward, the focus inside the monarchy shifted completely. Away from conflict, away from reaction, and toward construction. A new image, a new rhythm, a new identity, one that did not depend on drama to stay visible, but on purpose, on presence, on continuity. Instead of responding to every headline, the palace started filling the space with something else. Work, engagement, structure. A steady flow of activity that slowly redirected attention. Not forcefully, but gradually. And over time, that shift began to work. Because attention is limited. And when one story is no longer being fed, it begins to fade. Not disappear completely, but lose its power, its priority, its influence. And in its place, something new begins to grow. This was not accidental. It was designed. Every appearance, every initiative, every message, aligned with one goal, strengthened the identity of the monarchy, and make it stronger than any competing narrative. At the center of this strategy was consistency, not intensity, not reaction. Consistency, because consistency builds trust, and trust builds stability. And stability is what the institution depends on, more than anything else. While external narratives relied on spikes, moments of high emotion and attention, the palace focused on something different. Continuity. A steady presence that does not change with headlines. That does not depend on controversy. That exists beyond it. And that difference became the defining line. One side driven by visibility, the other by permanence. And over time, permanence wins. Because what is constant becomes familiar. And what is familiar becomes trusted. And what is trusted endures. This was the long game. Not weeks, not months, but years. A slow redefinition of how the monarchy is seen in the modern world. An environment where narratives move fast, but stability moves slow, and lasts longer. But perhaps the most important part of this phase was what didn't happen. There were no final statements, no dramatic endings, no public closure, because closure was never the goal. Distance was. Separation was. A clear structural shift that didn't need to be announced to exist. By this stage, the strategy had gone beyond response, beyond defense, beyond correction. It had become transformation. The monarchy was no longer reacting. It was reshaping itself, adapting, evolving, redefining its boundaries, and setting a model for the future. A model built on clarity, on control, on calculated restraint, and at the center of it stood Prince William, no longer a supporting figure, no longer behind tradition, but fully stepping into leadership, making decisions, setting direction, drawing lines when necessary, not as a brother in conflict, but as a protector of an institution. And beside him, Catherine remained the balance. Stability, composure, continuity. Together, they formed a dual approach. Strength and calm, action and presence, strategy and symbol. And this combination is now defining the future of the monarchy. As the world continues to watch, one question remains. Will this new model work? Will this shift toward structure and control create long-term stability? Or will it bring new challenges? The answer isn't immediate, because institutions like this don't change overnight. They evolve slowly, over time, through decisions that only reveal their impact later. But one thing is certain. The era of silent endurance is over. In its place is something new, more direct, more structured, more deliberate. A monarchy that no longer just exists, but actively defines itself. The lines have been drawn. The strategy is in motion. And now, the world is watching what happens next.